On October 12, 1944, a dreary English rain fell on a railway siding in Yorkshire. For Vera Hartman and the 200 other German prisoners of the 352nd Infantry Division, this was the grim culmination of weeks of brutal fighting in Normandy. Stepping from the cattle car after a grueling 3-day journey, hands bound and utterly exhausted, Hartman was braced for the brutality he had been promised. The propaganda from Berlin had been explicit. The British, masters of a cruel colonial empire, would show no mercy. They were to expect beatings, starvation, and forced labor unto death, a fate worse than a soldier's end on the battlefield. But the reality that unfolded on the platform was jarringly different. Instead of chaos and cruelty, Hartman saw an unnerving order. British guards stood in neat formations, their uniforms clean despite the weather, their rifles held with a precision that was uncomfortably familiar, a standard his own shattered division had long since abandoned in the desperate retreat across France. A middle-aged British sergeant approached, his steady gaze that of a man who had seen everything war could offer and was no longer impressed by it. He addressed the prisoners in accented but comprehensible German, his tone neither kind nor cruel, but matter-of-fact. "You will form orderly lines," he commanded. "You will be searched for weapons. You will then receive water and be transported to the camp." It was the voice of one professional soldier addressing another. The search that followed was thorough but not humiliating. Personal effects were catalogued, and the wounded were immediately separated for medical attention. Then, British soldiers moved down the lines with canteens, offering water to the very men they had been fighting just days before. As the cold, clean water passed his lips, Vera Hartman was struck with an undeniable clarity. This first encounter with British captivity had systematically dismantled every warning he had received. There were no beatings, only a disquieting and unexpected professionalism. For the German soldier Vera, the moment of capture was defined not by chaos or starvation, but by a calm, professional efficiency that seemed distinctly British. As trucks arrived, he overheard a conversation between two guards. One remarked on the poor bastards, to which the other replied, "Jerry or not, they're soldiers. Treat them accordingly." That single phrase, treat them accordingly would govern Vera's next 18 months in captivity, forcing him to confront uncomfortable truths about the regime he had served and the civilization he had been conditioned to despise. This was not an isolated sentiment, but the core of a deliberate system. By 1944, Britain held over 400,000 German and Italian prisoners in camps scattered across England, Scotland, and Wales. The entire apparatus operated on principles that balanced security with a fundamental respect for the enemy as human beings, as mandated by the Geneva Conventions. This approach was not born of idealism, but of calculated policy. It was understood that well-treated prisoners posed fewer security problems and that cooperative captives could provide vital intelligence. Furthermore, proper treatment was the surest guarantee of reciprocal conduct toward British POWs in German hands. But beyond pragmatism lay a deeper moral conviction. Britain's war was a defense of civilization, a cause that would be undermined by adopting the enemy's savagery. This ethos was instilled in the guards, many of them combat veterans from North Africa or France. Their superiority was to be demonstrated not through brutality, but through unshakable composure and adherence to standards. Sergeant Major William Thompson, who supervised guards at Camp 174 in Lanarkshire, articulated this philosophy perfectly. These men were our enemies. They fought for Hitler, killed our mates, bombed our cities, but they're prisoners now, which means they're our responsibility. We don't abuse them because we're not savages. For the British, the administration of their prisoner of war camps was a projection of national character, order maintained through discipline and fairness. The philosophy was that the barbed wire itself was a sufficient symbol of defeat. There was no need to beat men who had already been beaten. This restrained approach fostered a distinct atmosphere. Guards maintained a professional distance from prisoners, but interactions were marked by a formal courtesy. Orders were issued with clarity and enforced with consistency. Any violation of the rules resulted in disciplinary action, typically confinement or the reduction of privileges, but not the physical abuse that defined its German equivalent. The contrast was absolute and intentional, a demonstration that a democratic civilization could uphold its moral standards even under the extreme pressures of war. It was a pointed refutation of Nazi propaganda that dismissed democracies as weak and decadent. For newly arrived German prisoners, This reality created a profound cognitive dissonance. When Vera Hartman's transport reached Camp 174 in Lanarkshire on October 13, he was met not with the brutality he had been conditioned to expect, but with chilling efficiency. The facility held some 2,000 prisoners in wooden barracks, surrounded by the familiar apparatus of captivity, barbed wire and guard towers. Yet, while far from luxurious, the camp was weatherproof, organized, and clean. Processing was systematic and conducted in German, either by British personnel or interpreters. The documentation, medical examinations, and explanation of camp rules all spoke to a level of preparation that was both impressive and unsettling. Britain had clearly anticipated their arrival. The first meal was a revelation. Expecting starvation rations as promised by Goebbels's propaganda, Hartman was instead served an adequate dinner of bread, tea, margarine, and a stew containing actual meat, more sustenance than his unit had seen in the final weeks of fighting in Normandy. "I couldn't understand it," Hartman recalled in a 1987 interview. "We'd been told the British would treat us worse than animals. Instead, we received more food than we'd seen in weeks, slept in dry barracks with real beds, and weren't beaten." The disconnect was so stark that it left many prisoners utterly disoriented. For many arriving German prisoners, there was a palpable sense of dread, an expectation that their initial treatment was temporary, a prelude before the real brutality began. But that moment of expected cruelty never arrived. Instead, they were met with a rigid, yet predictable, system. Camp regulations, posted in German, were explained with bureaucratic clarity. Work was mandatory, defiance was punished, and escape would be met with determined recapture. Yet within this framework, certain rights were codified. Medical care was provided, religious services permitted, and censored letter-writing allowed. While hardly benevolent, the rules were characterized by a stark, impartial fairness, applied to all without favoritism. The cornerstone of this system was the work program, a measure both legal under the Geneva Conventions and vital to Britain's war-strained economy. With millions of its own men in uniform, the nation faced a severe labor shortage. German prisoners of war became an essential workforce, toiling in fields and forests, harvesting crops, clearing land, and repairing farm buildings. The labor was arduous but not deliberately punitive. Prisoners worked 8-hour days, received additional rations for their efforts, and were provided with adequate tools. The British farmers supervising them were given clear instructions: exact an honest day's work, but do not abuse the men. This policy is echoed in the testimony of men like OB 0.03%, a figure lower than Britain's own civilian population. While there was a pragmatic interest in keeping prisoners healthy for labor, the psychological impact was profound. It demonstrated that Britain valued human life, even an enemy's. Ultimately, what struck the Germans was not kindness, but something more powerful: consistent, unshakable British restraint in circumstances where cruelty would have been understandable. For guards who had lost friends to German weapons or seen the devastation of the London Blitz, this disciplined professionalism spoke volumes. Even as the full, horrific scale of the Reich's atrocities and the nature of its concentration camps became known, British captors adhered to a policy of professional distance and correct treatment. This principle was not merely theoretical. At Camp 174, when a British guard struck a German prisoner during an altercation, he was swiftly disciplined, reduced in rank, and reassigned. The camp commander, addressing the assembled prisoners, articulated the policy with chilling clarity: that man violated military discipline. In the British Army, we maintain standards regardless of circumstance. You will be treated correctly not because you deserve it, but because we demand it of ourselves. This unwavering self-discipline served as a potent psychological counterweapon. German prisoners, indoctrinated with propaganda about democratic weakness, could not interpret such consistent fairness as frailty when it was so clearly enforced by unshakable military authority. As Sergeant Major Thompson described the philosophy, it was a demonstration of superiority not through cruelty, but through the preservation of civilization. These men fought for evil, yes, he stated, but we don't lower ourselves to their level. When a German prisoner sees British guards treating him fairly despite having every reason to hate him, that teaches him more about civilization's strength than any beating could. This complex dynamic found its most poignant expression during the Christmas of 1944. Camp authorities permitted the prisoners to organize their own Protestant and Catholic services. Inside a barracks adorned with improvised ornaments, the Germans gathered. On Christmas Eve, as they sang Still Nacht, their voices drifted across the cold winter air. The British guards on duty stopped, listening in silence. When the hymn concluded, a few quietly applauded. Shortly after, a sergeant entered the barracks and distributed cigarettes and biscuits, a gesture not required by regulations, but one of common humanity. As prisoner Vera Hartman later recalled a moment, "We were singing about peace and hope while imprisoned by 4 German soldiers indoctrinated to see their enemy as subhuman." The reality of British captivity was profoundly disorienting. A Christmas service, held by men who had recently been trying to kill their guards, could have been an occasion for mockery. Instead, it was met with respect. The simple gesture of a British sergeant offering cigarettes with a "Happy Christmas, lads," shattered the crude caricatures of Nazi propaganda. This was not barbarism, it was a calculated policy of decency, one that maintained security and discipline while recognizing the prisoner's humanity. This approach found its most potent expression in the letters prisoners were permitted to send home. These letters became a quiet but powerful tool of psychological warfare. While Nazi broadcasts railed against Allied brutality, messages arriving in Germany described adequate food, fair treatment, and humane conditions. In December 1944, a prisoner named Vera wrote to his wife in bombed-out Hamburg, stating plainly, "Everything we were told about British cruelty was propaganda. Do not believe what you hear from Berlin." When his wife shared the letter with neighbors, the information created a ripple effect, undermining the state's credibility at its foundation. If the regime was lying about its captured soldiers, what else was a fabrication? The promised miracle weapons? The justifications for a hopeless war? British authorities understood this strategic value. The letters provided intelligence on German morale while systematically dismantling Nazi propaganda on the home front. For the prisoners themselves, this experience initiated a gradual ideological transformation. The initial shock of humane treatment gave way to a grudging acceptance that their captors were not monsters, opening the door to the first, dangerous questions about the regime they had served. For German prisoners, the end of the war precipitated a profound crisis of faith. If the military propaganda had been false, what else was a lie? The racial theories, the claims of conspiracy, the entire ideological foundation of the Reich they had fought for began to crumble. One such soldier, Hans Schmidt, later described his transformation within the camp. In the quiet absence of constant propaganda, he had time to think. He witnessed British guards treating prisoners with a fairness that contradicted years of indoctrination, and he conversed with fellow captives who openly admitted the moral bankruptcy of Nazi ideology. Access to heavily censored British newspapers, however limited, provided information they had never received in Germany. It was a slow, painful rebuilding of reality. British authorities recognized this potential for change, eventually implementing formal re-education programs. Yet for many, the transformation had already begun organically. When repatriation commenced in 1946, thousands of German prisoners volunteered to remain in Britain to assist with agricultural work. With their own cities in rubble and Britain facing critical labor shortages, an unlikely pact was formed. By 1948, approximately 25,000 former prisoners, including Hans Schmidt, stayed on as civilian workers, contributing to reconstruction projects. This remarkable transition from enemy combatant to voluntary laborer served as a powerful validation of British policy. It was a testament to the theory that decent treatment could create cooperation, reinforcing a national self-image rooted in civilized conduct and restraint. For Great Britain, the war was a crucible testing its most fundamental values. At the heart of the national identity was the conviction that Britain stood as a bastion of civilization against barbarism. The treatment of prisoners of war became a critical theater for this ideological conflict. To maintain civilized standards, even when dealing with an enemy who fought for an explicitly barbaric regime, was to confirm this essential self-image. This was not naive idealism, but a calculated demonstration of civilizational strength. By affording German prisoners fair treatment, a stark contrast to the brutality the Germans meted out to Allied prisoners and captive populations, Britain sought to prove which side truly represented civilization. This philosophy was articulated with clarity from the command level down. Captain Robert Ashford, the commander of Camp 174, saw it as the very core of their mission. We're fighting to defend civilization against Nazi barbarism, he argued. If we abandon civilized standards in how we treat prisoners, we've lost what we're fighting to preserve. For Ashford, British restraint and adherence to the rules, even for men who served an evil cause, was more powerful than any propaganda. It was a moral victory. This sentiment was echoed in the ranks. As Sergeant Major Thompson summarized bluntly, "We did it because maintaining civilized standards, even toward enemies, proves civilization's strength. That's how you win wars properly." The strategy was twofold: defeat the enemy on the battlefield, then demonstrate the superiority of your own values by treating them with a dignity their own government would never afford them. For the German prisoners who experienced this firsthand, the lesson was undeniable. They had not only been defeated militarily, but also morally, confronted by a concept of civilization far more resilient and profound than Nazi ideology had ever allowed them to comprehend. For former German soldiers like Vera Hartman, who lived until 2001 and maintained a lifelong correspondence with British veterans, the treatment received in captivity became a defining experience. In a 1995 interview, he articulated a profound shift in his understanding of the world. "The British could have treated us brutally," he recalled. "They had every moral justification for revenge. Instead, they treated us with a firm fairness that taught me more about civilization than 12 years of Nazi education ever did. That restraint, that was real strength." Hartman's experience was not unique. In the rain-soaked, dreary prisoner-of-war camps across Britain, a quiet but powerful lesson was unfolding. Amidst the grey English mornings, German soldiers who had been conditioned to expect retribution were instead met with professional discipline, adequate food, and fair treatment. This was not a matter of weakness, but a deliberate policy. For the thousands who anticipated torture but received professional conduct, who feared starvation but were given rations, these camps became their first tangible encounter with the values of the civilization they had fought against. This adherence to principle, even when dealing with a defeated enemy from a monstrous regime, became a testament to civilization's resilience. For Great Britain, the successful management of 400,000 prisoners with minimal mortality, eventually transforming many into voluntary workers and advocates for democracy, was more than a logistical achievement. It was definitive proof that civilized values were not a liability in wartime, but the very foundation of a lasting and meaningful victory.